Sounds good. Okay. All three judges are here and ready and can hear me. Judge Lee, are you here?
Yeah, I'm good to go.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay. If everybody's ready, I will get started. Hello, my name is Pascal de Colonge, and I'll be the first speaker for the affirmation from the Nueva School in firm support of the resolution that the People's Republic of China should abolish all restrictions on internal migration. This is a policy round because we're debating about whether or not a governmental actor, in this case the People's Republic of China, should enact a specific policy to abolish all restrictions on internal migration. As such, we as the affirmation are going to be proposing a plan we suggest you use to evaluate this resolution. If we can demonstrate that this plan is desirable under a varying mechanism of net benefits, or whichever team can do the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people, will have won today's debate. The plan is going to be the resolution that the People's Republic of China should abolish all restrictions on internal migration through normal ways and means as soon as possible. In other words, just the resolution right now. Now, for some brief background on what's going on. Basically, the main restriction that the People's Republic of China imposes on internal migration is what's called the hukou system, which is basically a system in which moving to any city or locale in China, you're required to have a permit there to be able to become a permanent resident and become a permanent migrant to that region. Otherwise, you're restricted from being able to achieve the legal status of a permanent migrant to that region. Many of these permits are quite expensive and very limited in their numbers. And indeed, we'll see just how many people have to go without permits or are restricted from migration because of this. However, we are abolishing the entire system, which is the primary restriction on internal migration in China. Okay. With that, let's go into our first of two advantages, which is specifically going to be about allowing all migrants to basically access unrestricted benefits. So right now, what's going on is that 63% of the population of China can reside in an urban. It does reside in an urban area. However, only 43% or so has the actually correct permit to reside in that area. The rest are actually legally restricted from achieving the legal status of residing in that area. For instance, in Beijing, the majority of the population is allowed to reside there, but almost 50% does not have the correct permit to reside there. Basically, what that means is they are relegated to a status of temporary worker instead of permanent migrant. Now, this is incredibly significant because the way the Chinese public state apparatus works is that you can't access a whole bunch of public services while you're living in a public area. Now, this is really important because in China especially, there's a large majority of the governmental state apparatuses is set up to provide universal services from the government, for instance, universal healthcare. Unfortunately, these temporary workers, if they are living in Beijing without a permanent migrant permit, cannot actually access these services. So we'll get into a little more about the exact consequences of this later on. But for right now, let's look at just how many people this has affected. The number of people who are currently living as permanent migrants in China has temporary migrants in China has expanded to 376 million people from only 135 in 2010, or 135 million in 2010. In other words, the number of people who are unable to bypass the restrictions or achieve the permanent migrant permit they need to access the full capabilities of life living in an urban area is dramatically expanding in the status quo. Indeed, we can also see the number of migrants overall is also expanding from only 30 million in 1989 to 140 million in 2008. According to the Congressional Executive Commission on China, the reforms that China has enacted to attempt to reduce the inequities created by this system are simply failing. It's unclear whether they're intended to fail or the Chinese government has just not been able to do anything. The main restriction they have added is being able to bypass the restrictions on accessing social services for some temporary workers instead of permanent migrants. However, because of the extremely stringent requirements they set, very, very few of the people are actually able to bypass those restrictions, leaving hundreds of millions of people still without access to essential services. So, what exactly does the affirmation do to fix it? Well, it's pretty clear what the affirmation does to fix it. We get rid of the system, which means we allow people to migrate wherever they want. And without this legal barrier towards migration, they can access the services wherever they want. That basically solves this issue. Now, what concrete benefits do we expect to see as a result of solving this issue? It turns out that being forced to live in urban areas without the benefit or protection of the law comes with a whole bunch of different and negative costs. For instance, again, according to the Congressional Executive Commission on China, we can see that right now, non-payment of wages for temporary workers is rampant in urban areas in China, especially for construction industries. This is especially worrying because many of these people are among the lowest paid people in China, meaning any sort of non-payment directly translates to a decrease in their quality of life. Indeed, we can see this happening empirically with education, because according to the International Labour Organization, over 50% of the 6.5 million migrant children are barred from attending school and are currently not in school because their temporary worker parents cannot pay the exorbitant fees necessary for them to go to school as non-permanent migrants. This is really bad, and it also exacerbates the impact of non-payment of wages. But further, we can see that there are health impacts as well. Over 80% of the temporary workers lack any sort of health insurance, which means that they account for many of the large-scale public health outbreaks. For instance, they recently accounted for 80% of Beijing's HIV cases, which again is probably not so great in terms of health of either the city around them or the health of them specifically. Finally, there's one more really significant impact here, which is that 1/3 of the current child population in China is what's called a left behind child now, which basically means that because all of these people are migrating without the actual permit they need to migrate, they physically cannot bring their children or have extremely strong incentives not to bring their children because their children wouldn't be able to access services. This means that children have to stay in rural areas and often go to worse schools and be separated from their parents while their parents move to urban areas. So on top of the poverty impacts here, which are incredibly dehumanizing and directly contribute to a loss of life expectancy, and the health impacts, which again directly contribute to a loss of life expectancy, and the lack of education for urban children, which is really bad because education is one of the best ways to break the cycle of poverty and avoid generational poverty, especially in the increasingly transitioning to knowledge economy world of China right now. The affirmation plan would help resolve all of these different societal issues. Now, let's go to the second advantage, which is going to be about urbanization in China. China has rapidly urbanized recently, but still isn't nearly as urbanized as comparable world superpowers like the US. Only 63% of China lives in urban areas. And remember, only about 40% of China is actually allowed to live in urban areas, whereas in the US, over 80% live in urban areas. Now, this may not sound hugely significant, but it actually is, because it turns out that in rural areas, the Chinese quality of life is far worse than in urban areas. As just one representative example, neonatal mortality, how often babies die, is over twice as high in rural areas than urban areas in China, whereas in urban areas, it's actually lower than US neonatal mortality. Now, what does the affirmation plan to do to fix this? One, it brings all of the left behind children, the 1/3 of total child populations, into cities in China. This is hugely significant because it means that there are millions more children that get to enjoy the benefits of urban life, including the increased life expectancy and decreased poverty that comes to this. It also just decreases urban, sorry, too late in my speech. Also just decreases urban poverty. Overall, this helps resolve poverty, which again is incredibly dehumanizing and causes a drop in life expectancy as well as direct suffering due to making hard choices between shelter, food, etc.
Okay. My name is Kira Chatwin, and I'll be the first speaker for the negative in today's round. I'll first be going over 3 negative contentions, and then I will go over the affirmative case in order. Okay. 8 minutes. Is anybody not ready? Okay. My time will begin now. We strongly negate the resolution that the People's Republic of China should abolish all restrictions on internal migration. We'll basically agree to their top of case. However, we want to provide just a little bit of inherency or what is already happening in the world right now. First of all, we see that reform is happening right now. Most of the cities in middle and western areas in China have canceled entry barriers for hookah registration, and in East China, the second and third tier cities, who are like the smaller cities, have also relaxed their requirements for registration. Furthermore, China is going to completely abolish household registration permits for cities with populations of less than 3 million for all of migrant workers. Its top, according to its top economic planner, which they've essentially already implemented. So we're seeing that reform is currently coming. Second is we see that the residence permits were issued in 31 provinces and municipalities to replace hookah requirements, which gives Chinese citizens more choices and flexibility while migrating to other parts of the country. And by the end of 2019, China had issued more than 100 million permits, and public services system based on residence permits have been established as well. So essentially, they're expanding the system of public resources available to these people in the status quo. With that, let's go on to our first contention, which is going to be that of rural economies. What we see happening in the status quo is first that rural economies are recovering right now. A is that China implemented a multi-sectoral intervention and infrastructure improvement, promotion of modern agriculture industries for more than 145,000 rural residents in 68 villages from 2013 to 2020. B is that rural urban migration is slowing now. 2.4 1.46 million fewer migrant workers migrated in 2019 than previously. And second is we see that restrictions on internal migration is key, as greater rural stability equals greater Chinese investment, because when we have more people staying in these rural areas, we see that on net, there's going to be more investment into these rural areas as the investment follows the people. However, what the plan specifically does is first that lifting all internal migration would lead to an exodus in rural areas to cities. Internal migration in the past has experienced rural to urban migrants increased to 221.1 million people. Is that this also discourages funding from going into underdeveloped and impoverished areas, because we see that now all of the people are moving towards these urban areas, which decreases funding specifically for these areas that need it, because it tends to be the rural areas that are most in need of development and access to these things such as services that they say is so important. B is that it also depletes the agricultural economy, because about 35% of China's labor force is in agriculture. So, and most of this is in the rural sector. So when you cause a massive migration, which they say is probably pretty likely, we're going to see the agricultural economy go down significantly. And sees that even if there is some amount of illegal migration happening now or movement happening now, this is nothing compared to what the widespread exodus would be if all restrictions were simply lifted, which is why we see that they specifically lead to the collapse of the agricultural sector. Now, a couple of internal links or reasons why this is really important. First is that investment is key. Look to how agricultural development was uniquely fostered by government investment. Having a sustained source of government income going into these rural areas is critical. And we tell you that this is dependent upon people actually staying in these rural areas. Second is that agriculture is the basis of China's economy. The agricultural sectors contributed around 7.3% to the gross domestic product, which is why we see that if you have a mass exodus from this agricultural based economy, we're going to see the economy is going to go down on net. There's a couple of impacts to this. First is that of poverty. We see that Anhui's per capita GDP was less than 40% that of its developed counterparts, and its average per capita income was considerably lower than the national average, which is why we see that investment into these specific areas that need them is a lot more important to reducing poverty than going to high-scale cities, for example. Second is that of unemployment. We see that a lot of people are going to lose their jobs because simply these big cities aren't going to be able to sustain a huge increase in population, which means that all of the jobs in the rural areas decrease, whereas the cities just cannot contain the rest of the population. And third is that of food security, because as agriculture goes down, so does food security. Our second disadvantage is going to be that of urban density. What we see happening in the status quo is first that China recently ended hukou restrictions for smaller cities. It abolished household registration permits for cities with populations of less than 3 million for out-of-towners. That essentially means that hukou is abolished for smaller cities. Second, we see that this is allowing smaller cities who couldn't otherwise compete with big cities to start to grow again. Is that before this was implemented, nearly 1/3 of Chinese cities had a shrinking population and 938 shrinking cities existed. Because, however, population in these cities is expected to go back up as 166 million people will move from rural to urban areas in the next 14 years, 75% of them headed towards these lower tier cities, which is why we see that this competitive advantage is ensuring that more people go to these smaller cities right now. And third is that due to this, smaller cities are expected to contribute significantly to the economy, as they would contribute 2/3 of incremental growth and national private consumption towards 2030. However, when they implement the plan, they open all migration, which ends the policy of favoring smaller cities, which causes economic movement specifically towards these bigger cities, because they essentially they not only have this appeal of the fact that they already are a big city and already have maybe more resources than smaller cities, but there's this idea that these big cities are going to provide more economic resources, which on net is bad, which is why we see that in the status quo, most of the population is growing in these big cities as opposed to these rural cities, which means that we need to specifically ensure that these rural cities maintain their advantage. And this is true for a couple of reasons. First is that overpopulated cities are bad as they contribute to pollution. Like the biggest 167 cities in the world, including 23 Chinese cities, accounted for 52% of global emissions and pollution. And second is that of decreased economic opportunities, because studies find that relatively small cities have been more conducive to economic growth than simply pouring more people into these high-scale cities. The impacts of this is just pollution, which causes hundreds of thousands of deaths every year, disease, which leads to higher population density, higher outbreaks of disease, and finally, the economy. Okay, let's go over the affirmative case. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, if there's more economic opportunity available in small cities than big cities, why are people flocking to cities like Beijing over small cities that are presumably even closer to them because there's more small cities?
Well, I would assume that there's generally a bigger appeal to big cities. Remember, they're currently on an even playing field right now, but bigger cities are currently growing at a higher rate than smaller cities in the status quo, which indicates there is some appeal, which means that we have to balance it out. Okay, on their first advantage of access. The overview here is that unrestricted benefits is bad for two reasons. It leads to overcrowding and leads to rural exodus, which ultimately lead to a decrease in the amount of opportunities that people have access to on net. They tell you that there's currently a big problem because temporary workers are like falling apart right now. They don't have access to resources. The thing is, the status quo is already reinvestment into the resources for these workers. China's investing into the infrastructure that's specifically going to get them access to public resources. Furthermore, we see that China's opening up these smaller cities, which means that they now have opportunities to go there and attain their status there and have access to full public service. That's why they would move to smaller cities over big cities in the world of the negative. Now, they tell you they're going to have full access to all of these services now, but that unfortunately is not true because a lot of the people who are already living in these high-rise cities are already going to have an advantage. Just like imagine someone from the middle of Texas coming into the Silicon Valley. They aren't going to have enough money to sustain themselves or be able to survive, especially if they're coming in right now, which means that they probably don't solve for all the impacts because the costs in high cities are so high that they're going to not be able to access education or maybe health resources either way, which means that their decreased quality of life is probably non-unique. The only way that they get access to these impacts is if they go to smaller cities where they can actually get access to these like resources. On their contention about urbanization, the overview here is that, first of all, urbanization is not necessarily a good thing because we see that agricultural resources are critical to both China's economy and having a stable like population balance within China. But second of all, that urbanization directly contributes to a lot of things like premature deaths, overpopulation, overconsumption, pollution, and disease, which ultimately leads to worse impacts for China on net. The lack of we would also argue that targeted urbanization of China is better, focus on smaller cities instead of big, which is why ultimately you're going to be voting negative in today's round.
Right, it's going to be neg in order than F in order. I'll touch the top of case stuff at the top. All right. My time will start. Now, our opponents claim that reform is happening right now in the status quo. First of all, extent what my partner tells you from the 1AC that very, very few people in the status quo can actually bypass these restrictions. There are many, many people currently residing in cities that physically cannot get access to healthcare, and like only the affirmative can solve, even despite the reform that the negation claims is happening. On to the neg. First neg. Top level in like the entire negation case, like let people go where they want to go, because presumably people want to go where they make the most money. First of all, our opponents argue that China is promoting the rural economy right now, and like the app is bad for the rural economy. First of all, we'll make the argument that the left behind children that my partner talks about is also really, really bad for the rural economy at the level where people are literally having their parents yoink from them in their childhood so they can go work in the city. The affirmative is able to actually like let these people take their children with them. Left behind children is uniquely bad for the rural economy because like children take resources and don't produce resources, so it's bad for the economy.
The main issue with the rural economy is dependence in China.
Yeah, the main issue with the rural economy is dependence in China, and left behind children is a phenomenon that uniquely exacerbates dependence. Our opponents also argue that rural stability needs to be increased. We completely agree with them that rural stability needs to be increased. We just argue that if our opponents agree that in the status quo, rural quality of life sucks, and you should probably let people get out of that quality of life in the status quo. We'll make the argument that specifically the affirmation incentivizes China to actually invest in rural development because specifically, like the affirmation, because exactly what the negation is telling you, China wants people to be in these rural areas, and the best way for them to do it right now is to just gate people from going to urban areas. But in the world of the affirmation, the best way for China to get people to stay in rural areas is to actually improve their quality of life. Also, like kind of top level, you can we'll make the response that China is under urbanized in the status quo as compared to the United States, which is probably a warrant for why this is not like a massive problem at the level where the United States can subsist on a much higher urbanization level. At the level where the United States has like literally half of the rural population of China and is still able to like produce agriculture. Our opponents make the argument that there's excess in the status quo and it's not that big. My partner's warrant tells you that the exodus right now is literally a fifth of China's population. This is not a small population at all, and not a small magnitude impact that the affirmation is solving for. Our opponents make the argument that the government won't do anything in the world of the affirmation to help rural areas, but we argue that Xi's policy right now is that of eliminating rural poverty. This is we would make the argument that China is going to throw whatever they can that they can in order to resolve rural poverty, regardless of whether or not what is going on in the cities. Yeah, our opponents make these arguments about agriculture, about how 7.5% of the GDP. We'll make a just note. We'll just note that 7.5% of the GDP is very small, and also agriculture is like a pretty important industry at the level where it's like the industry that feeds your people. We're pretty sure C is not going to be cutting funding into agriculture.
China likes paying people to go to high-paying jobs in sectors.
Yeah, China likes paying people to go into high-paying jobs in sectors that they like normally wouldn't, which is a warrant for why again they're going to like China's going to continue to feed its people. On the second disadvantage about urban density. First of all, we'll make the argument that people will go to small cities in the world of the affirmation at the level where China, first of all, builds like 250 million population small cities in 2013 for these people to specifically go into. Specifically, you can extend like a libertarian argument of foot voting at the level where people will probably, if what the negation tells you is true and like quality of life in the big cities is really, really bad, people will probably stop going to the big cities. So if the impact scenario of the negation if the impact scenario of the negation plays out, then the negation will just lead to people actually moving from big cities to small cities, which the affirmation specifically completely lifts the restrictions on them being able to actually do that. But secondarily, we'll make the argument that cities are actually shrinking in the status quo at the level where 60% of China's total urban population lives in shrinking cities. And a decade from now, more than 600 million Chinese people will still live in shrinking cities. Just for context, 85 out of 363 cities in China have been actually growing cities. There's a reason for this, which is out of birth rate decline. The birth rate decline is a uniquely urban phenomenon because empirically industrialization is the driving cause behind birth rate decline as manual labor is de-emphasized and more hands on deck becomes like a liability rather than a benefit. This means that cities, that like specifically the big cities and specifically the urban cities will soon be depopulated and like this isn't actually a problem that's about to happen. Yeah. Also, we'll make the argument that the affirmative specifically key to urban development in the status quo and like making space in these big cities for people to come to, which they are already coming to in the status quo. We make the argument that like you can cross apply the construction workers warrant from the 1AC as to how like construction workers are physically not being paid in the status quo. The only way to actually get good urban development, good urban construction in the status quo to accommodate the influx of migrants that is happening, regardless of whether or not you do the affirmation, is to do the affirmation.
Also, public health.
Yeah, also, yeah, extend like public health is just much better in urban cities. It's just like much better in the urban areas right now. At the level where like neonatal mortality is like 1/2 the rate that it is in rural areas. And like specifically, even if urban overpopulation is high in the status quo, we tell you that specifically public health is still neonatal mortality in urban China is still better than neonatal mortality in urban United States, which is a word for why public health is not as bad as they claim that it is. Onto the app. You can extend that there are a ton of people right now that the affirmation has to help, like at the level where 43% have only 43% of people actually have hukou of rural China actually have hukou in like the cities that they're residing in, and 63%, like the difference, like 20% of China essentially is residing in urban areas and do not get access to benefits in rural areas. Our opponents make the argument that the status quo is actually solving for this, but again, extending my partner's argument that very few temporary workers in the status quo can actually bypass these restrictions.
It's also growing.
Yeah, and like also this population is growing in the status quo. Our opponents, like there's a massive problem at the level where the population that we were talking about was 135 million in 2010 is now 376 million people. This is a massive this is not only a massive impact, but also a massive impact that is going to happen regardless of whether or not we increase urban migration. This means that it's basically try or die for the affirmation because the negation cannot resolve for these 43 people. For these 1/5 of China that is being physically denied access to healthcare education in the status quo. Our opponents argue that the cost of living in big cities will be, in high population cities will be extremely high. We argue, first of all, people are already there. They are already living in these high cities and they are being denied and their cost of living is being exacerbated by the fact that they physically don't get access to health insurance. But secondarily, our opponents will make the argument that like again the foot voting argument at the level where people can just go into small cities then like our opponent's argument collapses at the level where they're arguing that simultaneously that people don't want to go into small cities and that small cities are much better than big cities. Eventually this problem will even out as long as we lift the restrictions on people being able to move, which is like what the affirmation does.
People are clearly willing to find economic opportunity to the point where they're leaving their children.
Yeah, people are clearly willing to move to find better economic activity at the point where they're leaving their children behind in their rural towns and moving to urban cities in order to like find better economic opportunity. They're going to go to the small cities in the world of the affirmation. You can extend the link scenario of the affirmation at the level where we just basically instantaneously get 376 million people access to payment of wages, access to the ability to send their children to school, access to the health insurance. That is so bad in the status quo. Our opponents make tons of arguments about how like urbanization is really bad for health, or like urban overpopulation is really bad for health. But we argue not having health insurance is also really bad for health. At the level where 80% of Beijing's HIV cases are from these people without hukou and access to health insurance. You can extend the 1/3 of people children are in the status quo or left behind children Like this is really, really bad. The impacts, you can extend the poverty impacts as to how poverty is the biggest impact in today's round. Specifically, the cycle of poverty, first of all, extends infinitely into the future without access to education to break the cycle of poverty, which means that you should be voting to actually get people educated, get money in people's hands so they don't have to like get HIV and get who's access to work. You should be voting to get people in poverty access to wages in this that they are being denied in the status quo. On the second advance about urbanization, just extend that like the average household income in urban areas is twice the average household income in rural areas. Like urban is clearly better than rural in the status quo, and only the affirmation gets people into urban areas.
Okay, my order is going to be an overview, the second neg contention about urban density, then the first neg, and then the aff in order. You need me to repeat the order? Are we good? Okay. This round is not a matter of whether or not people can get access to public services or whether they can migrate, but where they migrate and whether or not the public service actually has quality or not. Small city growth, we argue, is going to be key to overall economic growth. The high concentration of workers in large cities will not only undermine the quality of life for everyone living in the city, but also result in worsening impacts of industrialization. Let's go on to the second dissent more specifically. Now, they talk about how people are just going to go to small cities when these internal migrations are abolished, but this is number one, this is what's happening right now, which probably means that the status quo solves better. But secondly, this is not true because when opportunity arises, when these people see that they are able to move to bigger cities, they will go to those bigger cities, even if those bigger cities are in reality unaffordable, because these big cities or like Beijing are portrayed to have a lot of opportunities and a lot of like good services for them, when in fact they do not, because there'll simply be too many workers migrating there, meaning that there simply won't be a move towards small cities at the point where there's just that inherent appeal to like cities like Beijing and cities like Beijing. Then they talk about how people are just gonna go to small that. Next, you should look to how like small cities right now are able to grow in the status quo, and this was not able to happen before when there was like when restrictions were like this was not able to happen before, and this is only happening now because they're like loosening hukou restrictions for smaller cities in the status quo, which is like a reason for why this degree of lower restrictions is solving the issues right now. Secondly, they talk about how secondly they talk about how like cities are already shrinking, but this is cities are already shrinking, but this is not true, because like we will argue that small cities would shrink even more when you loosen like migration restrictions, because then people are just going to flock to huge cities, and we will argue that this is really, really bad, because if small cities stop growing, it leads them to lose the resources and lose the funding they need to continue in their public services. But moreover, when you overpopulate big cities, it contributes to pollution and contributes to decreased economic opportunities, and they uniquely concede the argumentation that overpopulation in big cities lead to worsening public services, meaning even if all these temporary migrant workers suddenly can get access to public services, the services are not like readily available, and they probably aren't good either at the point where the cities simply just cannot support the huge population they have now. On to the first contention. Sorry. The overview here is that investment in the rural economy can only increase when there exists a rural population. Why would China invest in an area when there's no one there? China is only, we will argue that China is, they're incentivizing investment now because rural migration is slowing. Look to how there's 2.46 million fewer immigrant workers from rural areas moving to urban areas. And this is like moving in it's moving in synergy with China's investments in developing like the agricultural economy. They talk about how the app would incentivize such rural development, but this is not true, because at the point where rural farmers are just going to move to big cities, why there simply won't be enough funding going into these rural economies, and there's no reason why like they would support a depleting agricultural workforce. Then they talk about how like the agricultural economy is a small magnitude impact. This is not true. We will argue that the food production that comes from agriculture is key to supporting like city life in the first place, because if people can't eat food, how would they work? Secondly, we would also say that investment is also key to support the rural farmers who can't move, even with the decreased restrictions. Like obviously, we're not saying that the entire like agricultural economy would just like be destroyed, but we would say that you're leaving a group of vulnerable farmers who are no longer getting the investment to continue to farm in like an unstable economy, because there's just a lack of government investment in that area. Let's go on to the first affirmative. Extend my partner's overview about how unrestricted benefits is going to be bad for the reasons of overcrowding and a rural exodus. They talk about how like people in China doesn't have benefits, but those 20% can move to small cities and still get benefits and good benefits. But secondly, we will argue that resident permits are already literally mass distributed, and China is already planning to distribute them more, and they're working and they're building infrastructure to support such resident permits in the status quo without facilitating like a massive exodus and massive overcrowding. Then they talk about how people are like moving to cities in the status quo, and look to how like parents are leaving their children in urban areas. But this is not true. It has actually decreased because like government, this has been decreasing in recent years amid these interim restrictions. Just look to the warrants on our first disadvantage that Go conceded. Then they talk about secondly, they talk about how there will be a cycle of poverty, and because they can't bring their children to like the cities. But we will argue that this is simply going to be even worse in their case, because when you are going to high cost big cities, and people are gravitating towards those cities in pursuit of quote unquote better opportunities that don't actually help them, because they have to compete against like thousands of workers for that one job, and they won't be able to get that job, meaning that they end up unemployed and they end up in worse poverty and worse conditions than they were previously. Probably means that you should buy that the affirmative is going to be worse for the impacts of poverty and like in education and health. Let's go into urbanization. This contention the responses here go conceded in the NG almost. They talk about how they don't really respond to my partner's argument about how targeted urbanization would be far better, because when you have concentrated urbanization, like in cities like Beijing, you lead to overconsumption, you lead to pollution. Look to how there's like consistently like a gray smog layer above these kind of quote unquote industrial these industrial and big cities. We will argue that this is probably bad, because when you start loosening up these migration restrictions again, you're just worsening these impacts by creating higher population density and increasing the spread of disease, increasing pollution, and decreasing the quality of life for children and for families who are then now moving there. Let's go on to some weighing actually. Now, their main argument here is that they're going to be able to give like migrant workers access to social services, and they give access like because right now they can't access it in the status quo. Firstly, you have to note the fact that even if they can get social services, even if they can get access to such infrastructure, the chances of that infrastructure being able to support all of the people are extremely low. Look to my partner's argument about how the people who are living there, who already have like a stable like income and have that and have the financial means to access those resources, would be more able to do so than the people who are just coming in and who don't hold as much financial ability as the people as high income people are already living in the cities, which means that the social services you provide probably won't be able to be won't be attainable. But secondly, it will probably be worse because of like overcrowding and the fact that cities won't be able to support them. Secondly, you should look to the argument of industrialization. Now, we will argue that industrialization independently would be bad in overcrowded cities, but even if you buy the industrialization is good, it will be better in smaller cities and in like where growth can be like where growth can be like evened out, and like there will be more economic opportunities because there won't be as much competition for the same job. For all those reasons, I strongly urge a vote for negation. Okay. This is going to be last speech for the negative. It's going to be mostly like big picture stuff. So if you're flowing this, it'd probably be easier to float it on a new sheet. But I'm also generally going to be going the negative and then the affirmative. So it could also flow that way. Okay, 4 minutes. Anybody not ready? My time will begin now. At the end of the day, this round is not a question of whether Chinese citizens can migrate or not, because fundamentally they can in either world. Both sides inherently abolish some form of the hukou, which means that free migration happens at least to some part of China. That means that in either world, migration can happen for everybody who wants to migrate. Rather, this round is a question of where they ought to migrate to. We believe that having workers go towards small cities and decreasing population density is preferable to a world in which free choice means that big cities are built up at the expense of quality of life. Recognize, Judge, that big cities are like chasing the end of a rainbow. It looks bright and shiny and promises a whole lot of things, but at the end of the day, you can never reach it because big cities do three bad things. First is that they impose high costs on their residents, which ultimately plunges a lot of people into poverty because they can't afford the social services that are available in these high-cost cities. Even if they think that they're going to go there for better opportunities, ultimately the costs prevent them from accessing them. Second is that of disease. Remember, in high density situations, this specifically contributes to the spread of disease, specifically COVID-19, which is going to lead to massive economic devastation for all of the people who want to enter these cities because you increase the transmissibility of disease when you go to high density regions. And third is that of pollution, because ultimately big cities produce a lot of pollution in a very small area, which means that people are exposed to life-threatening air pollution that kills hundreds of thousands of people every single year. If you're sending a bunch of people to cities only to die, this is not a good thing. We want to preserve both quality of life.
Point of order.
Yeah, on what?
Sorry, it's a new argument that air pollution specifically kills hundreds of thousands each year.
That was definitely read in the LOC on the disadvantage on.
I may have missed it. Judge's discretion.
Yeah, but judge's discretion. Okay. I have like 1 minute and 30 seconds so far. Okay, so my time will resume now. We see that ultimately we do not want people going to these big cities because that is what leads to death. That is what leads to disease. And that is what leads to the never-ending cycle of poverty. My opponent's isolate is so bad. Small cities specifically are empirically better at contributing to economic growth. They empirically create more job opportunities because there's just less costs, there's more open space, there's more things to work with and more places to go in smaller cities, which is why ultimately smaller cities have less disease, less pollution, less costs, and increase access to the social services they care about. Now, judges, Pascal's going to get up and tell you a very convincing, pretty speech that tells you a lot about how we have to cater to the people in the cities right now. Remember, the PMR is not allowed to make new arguments, not allowed to add warrants or implications or make a blip into an argument, and not allowed to make new responses to arguments from the 1C. We hold the PMR to a high standard for this. But let's go over a couple things Pascal's going to go for. First, they're going to say that everybody's going to go to small cities either way. Two responses here. First, it's just a no risk negative, because if the same thing happens in either world, all you do is risk the chance that people go to big cities instead and risk rural collapse. Second, this is empirically false. While Beijing and Shanghai and big cities are growing and have been growing, smaller cities have not, which indicates that there is some unknown appeal for these big cities in the status quo that just doesn't exist for the smaller cities, which means that we have to focus on the small cities. Second, Pascal's going to tell you that we need to help the people in cities right now. But remember, they tell you themselves a lot of these people are already unstable jobs. They'll want to move somewhere where they can have a better quality of life. They've already migrated, or at least partially migrated, so moving there would be good. They also tell you that these people would probably move to smaller cities in their world either way, which indicates that you're going to be seeing all the benefits of the negative world realized. Third, they're going to tell you that rural investment is going to increase when they relax restrictions. But again, there's two responses to this rural investment point they have. First, there's no reason this wouldn't happen when they open up small cities as well, because they fundamentally haven't made that big of a distinction between the world of the affirmative and the world of the negative. And second, this is already happening in the status quo because China's investing a lot into their agriculture. You only risk that you make it worse. And fourth, finally, they're going to go for the world right now is pretty bad. But at the end of the day, the world right now is not a bad world. China literally just released restrictions on allowing more people to go to these smaller cities, which indicates the world right now is a world of opening economic growth, a world in which projections now estimate massive migration to these smaller cities. And these smaller cities are going to empirically improve the quality of life for all of the participants in the world right now. The main difference is where the people go. And we'd argue that smaller cities are better, which is why you vote negative.
Okay, I'll be going over some of the key issues in this debate, and hopefully not doing any of the things the last speaker told me not to do. With that, 5 minutes, my time will start now. Judge, as our opponents say, we're going to be saying the world right now is pretty bad. We think the world right now is pretty bad because a fifth of the Chinese population lives in cities where they can't access healthcare, they can't access schools, they can't even get their wages paid consistently. We're going to say the world right now is pretty bad because that population has almost doubled in the past 10 years, despite similar reforms to the one the negation is talking about. We're going to say the world right now is pretty bad because the reforms the negation is talking about have been analyzed, and according to us, since the PMC, very few people were able to actually use these because of the extremely stringent standards they set. We're going to say the world right now is pretty bad because people are being denied the opportunity to seek out a way to get out of poverty. They're being denied the opportunity to get themselves a better life. That's why the world right now is pretty bad. They're living in cities where they are not welcome, even though they are there because that's the best chance for themselves and their children. Let's go over the biggest issue in this round, which is the fact that a fifth of the Chinese population right now lives in cities where they cannot access public services, they cannot access healthcare, they cannot access schools for their children. This is catastrophic. As we've already analyzed as not contested in this round, people living in areas without hukou permission basically often can't get access to wages and suffer from extreme poverty on top of the specific impacts we've isolated. In this case, this means that 300 million people cannot get access to any sort of get wages consistently, and the affirmation immediately fixes this. This is the biggest impact on the round on scope and magnitude. Specifically, it's also the biggest impact on the round on time frame. We're going to say that specifically we outweigh on magnitude here because we affect the most number of people. Affecting large scope number of people is really important in order to take into account the needs of the many rather than privileging the needs of the few. It's also the most objective way to evaluate different impacts. It also is the fastest impact to happen. As soon as the plan passes, all of these people can get access to services. Our opponents try and say that like city infrastructure won't be able to support the new influx of people, but what they miss is that the premise of the affirmation case is that these people are already in cities. They just aren't being allowed to access schools without paying exorbitant fees first. The affirmation lets them no longer pay exorbitant fees to access schools. Therefore, we're winning here. Faster impacts that happen sooner are far more probable because every second before the links trigger is a potential failure point where something else could happen. The Chinese government could change their mind, something else could happen, etc., etc., etc. Indeed, we can see this is happening right now because their impacts are all in the future. It opens up the chance for controversy over, as we say and maintain, they never effectively respond to, whether or not people will even be able to effectively utilize the restrictions they talk about. That's why we're winning the round. You may be tempted to vote on industrialization, on all of these new people coming into cities. Again, you don't actually need to evaluate new people coming into cities to debate the affirmation case at all, because the fundamental premise of the affirmation case is about how many people are already in cities. But on top of that, we see we actually solve for a lot of these impacts better. For instance, they focus really heavily on disease, but my partner and I repeatedly extend the impact that the majority of disease outbreaks in Beijing in the case of HIV occurred in these migrant workers that didn't have access to healthcare. By giving them healthcare, we make disease in Beijing better, not worse, because we eliminate what 80% of the HIV in Beijing came from. That's a really big impact for us for disease. Now, let's look into the issue of urbanization and small versus big cities, because that's what the negation tries to frame this round in terms of. Unfortunately, they are largely incorrect here, because what they talk about is how people will migrate to big cities instead of small cities because of this nebulous appeal that big cities have. We see that there are three issues with this, all of them extended to my partner's speech. The first is that specifically, if people are willing to go so far to seek out the last iota of economic opportunity to leave their children behind, that's a pretty strong signal that they're willing to go wherever has the best economic opportunity. If the negation is correct, this means a fair number of them would go to small cities. We don't actually think the negation is super correct here because we think big cities also offer huge potential, as evidenced by the fact that there are a fifth of Chinese population that's living semi-illegally in big cities because they think there's economic potential there, and because the economic average income in big cities is double that in rural areas, both of which seem like to us pretty good warrants for why big cities are good. But even if you think that big cities aren't good, the affirmation still solves while also immediately solving for the lives of 300 million people. At the same time, we would also argue that we solve for rural poverty better than they do, for the simple reason that they concede our argument that the main issue in rural China right now is dependence. The main issue with dependence is the fact that a third of the Chinese child population is left behind while their parents go to work in cities in rural areas, which is far worse for the rural economy than anything else. Similarly, you can't be voting on agriculture because everybody agrees that Xi really cares about feeding his people and is probably going to keep funding agriculture until they can feed his people. The US also functions at a lower share of agriculture than China, which suggests he's capable of doing that. At the end of the day, you vote for the affirmation because the biggest impact in the round is the 300 million people's lives that we can immediately make better by doing the aff. They don't substantively contest this. And despite everything they say about the status quo solving, it's clearly not, given that the number of people in these situations keeps expanding. Thank you.
Good round, you guys.
Good
Good
round.
round.
It was a fun
Good luck.
round.